that is the real life manifestation of those beliefs, because those people, I assume, will be thinking in that scenario, it's less serious, the man has control in that situation, the woman is smaller and weaker so she couldn't possibly hurt him. All of these beliefs that come into our judgments of those crimes. So what we have is a picture where it seems to me very clear that we have a picture of domestic violence from statistics that is not gendered. As in, it's nowhere near as exaggerated as our mind's perception of domestic violence would have us believe. So we have many, many men a year who suffer from domestic violence. We have domestic abuse in homosexual relationships. However, when we ask people to judge these scenarios, when we take people out and about and do social experiments, we see these fundamentally different reactions when you swap the genders. And when we ask ourselves why that is, hopefully you guys kind of buy what I've just told you in terms of that amassing of gender stereotypes and how that influences the nature of how we judge those crimes. Now I'm going to talk briefly, just for the last 10 minutes, about how we can change this. And the reason I've put and why we should want to is because for everyone in here, hopefully, and for me as a personal opinion, for me it's obvious because we have victims. It doesn't matter whether they are women or men. However, when you look at the current initiatives that we have in place, it would be very easy to think that we don't care about male victims at all, and why should we? And that's for me, a very dangerous place to be. So in terms of what I think needs to happen is that we need to be tackling this at a number of different levels. Some are more achievable than others. In terms of the political narrative, and I know Mark Brooks has spoken about this on a number of occasions, but the political narrative tends to be very gender exclusive at the moment. And we've just seen the Istanbul Convention today I think it's maybe being presented towards the House of Commons tomorrow, and that is a completely gender biased document that a number of countries are signing up to around Europe that specifically outlines things like domestic abuse as a gendered issue that is perpetrated by men towards women. Now, if you are a male victim of domestic abuse and you see initiatives and policy and legislation at the highest level in terms of being adopted across Europe, how does that fundamentally make you evaluate and feel about your abuse? And for me, it's exactly the same as the Vogue strategy. Now, Ali Fogg has done great work at getting Alison Saunders to put a little sentence on the bottom saying, also includes data on men and boys, like it's a little extra tagline that should make you feel better about being a male victim. But the strategy itself, and brackets, all the funding that goes alongside that, is violence against women and girls. So fundamentally in your mind, how does that build up a picture to you in terms of your abuse that you may have suffered? And I have a lot of gripe with the Vogue strategy beyond many people, because I actually think things like that reinforce not only the position of men as perpetrators, but the position of women as victims. I think it does a greater disservice, and it's the same thing, same problem I have, and I wrote a blog post about this, about the Nottinghamshire hate crime classification, misogynistic hate crime. Now, hate crime and sexual harassment is obviously a very big problem, I'm not denying that, but what I'm saying is by enshrining misogynistic hate crime in law, what we're basically saying is not only that men are particularly dangerous and particularly likely to harass you and grab you on the street, we're reinforcing the idea and this space in women's minds and men's minds about women as victims as well. And what happens is if you're a man and you become a victim, what you're having to grapple with is just a fundamental violation of how you view yourself in relation to the world. So it's no wonder why they don't report and that they have psychological problems associated as well. Because you're thinking, wow, maybe I'm fundamentally just not anywhere near the person I thought I was. That's a really big thing. And I don't say this, I mean it's very clear, I don't say this to undermine the experiences of women, but when women are domestically abused and sexually assaulted, unfortunately, because of those stereotypes we build up, it does actually fit more easily within their own conceptualizations of their victimization. So it can be a shock in the extent that domestic abuse is always a shock, and sexual violence is always a shock and a terrible thing, but it's less of a fundamental deconstruction of how we understand the world when it is when men become victims. And I want to stress that's not undermining the experience of female victims at all, but it's just saying for too long we've ignored and asked the opposite question. And things like training and policy within professional bodies, and we're seeing it fall between a rock and a hard place at the moment, because either we have training that is gender biased and just talks about women, or we see training that doesn't talk about gender at all. And there are problems with each of those, because if you don't talk about gender at all, you're not addressing the specific problems that men have when they become victims. Academia needs to do better. We haven't done enough, and I'm trying to lead a group of academics, the Domestic Violence Against People Network, who are looking to try and do more research outside of that traditional pairing, male perpetrator, female victim. But we need to do more, and we need to have a much more open and less combative conversation about our models of domestic violence. Because if you say that you disagree with the Duluth model, then you're not worthy of doing domestic violence research. And I just think that that is all part of the needless gender war that we are engaged in. But we need to be better at coming up with broader, more inclusive explanations of domestic violence as well. And I'm not saying by any means that male victims read academic papers, but the fact that the research, the statistics, I mean, the ONS is to blame as well. I've emailed the Office of National Statistics a number of times because their breakdowns for male victims are not as extensive, and therefore not as important. I want to know how many of those were partners, how many of those were dates. This information doesn't exist, it's not recorded. Why? Why isn't it recorded? Why is it less important? They're all victims. The media needs to play their part as well, and there are some examples of where they are doing this. There was a long-running line on Hollyoaks. It's not like my favourite show, but it's good for groundbreaking narratives, because Stay and Brendan had an abusive homosexual male relationship, and EastEnders also tackled this, and I will just very quickly show you a little bit of Tina and Tosh interacting.
When it doesn't happen, it just makes me feel bad inside. So bad you couldn't even answer my calls earlier? Or come back and see me? I did come back, actually. You was asleep. Right, so where were you? When I called you? I was at work. You know I was. How come you stink of booze? I went to the Vic. On your own? Oh, Tosh, please don't do this. I was with Johnny. Of course you were. I was. We were playing darts. You with someone else? No. Answer your phone. You sneak out. Are you seeing another woman? You want to be free. You want to do your own thing. You don't want to get tied down to me. You've never wanted me to have this baby. That is not true. Why do you keep saying that? Because you don't care about me. Of course I care. Tosh, please don't do this. We're getting drunk in the pub. Well, I'm here having lost our baby. Okay, you haven't lost anything. There was no baby. That's exactly what you wanted, isn't it? Why do you say that? Do you want us to have a kid? You've got your lovely family in the pub. I mean, you've got your brother and your sister, your little niece and nephews. Oh, maybe it wasn't meant to be. Look, stop it, all right? I said I'm sorry for that. I didn't mean it. What is it? You're scared. You're scared, aren't you? Oh, I'm going to be a proper good mum. Not like you, screwing everything up with Jar Jar. You're jealous. But I'm going to have something I can love properly instead of you.
So that's a representation we haven't seen before, which is great. And I love, Chrome actually said, I've detected unusual behaviour. Yes. So we need more representations like that in the media, because that's one of the main ways that we pick up information about gender in the world around us is through the media. And so having those representations will make people go, oh, a woman just punched a woman. That's expanded my mind a little bit about what women are capable of. More broadly than this, we need to think about maybe also tackling the much broader systems of gender that we kind of let envelop our young boys and girls, and the messages that we give them. One of the key examples for me is about emotional expression in boys. There are hundreds of studies that show that we systematically push boys away from emotional expression. Now, if we made inroads in not doing that quite so much and allowed them to be more emotionally expressive, would they then feel more able as victims to talk to people in support networks? It's the same thing that ties into things like male suicide, is one of the reasons that we have such a gendered issue in terms of suicide, because men feel that they can't be emotionally expressive and can't approach peers when they have problems. So there's also a question there for me to be asked about how we tackle this from when boys and girls are young, how we teach them about gender and relationships from when they are very young as well. Most importantly, and what I would always say to people is, domestic violence is a crime that is deeply coloured by gender, but it's not a gendered crime. And many people use that phrase to describe things like domestic abuse, things like rape and serious sexual assault. But we have to acknowledge the impact that gender has, because it clearly does have an impact on how the victims make sense of their own experience. And this is what I was mentioning about social policy and training. If you go too far and just go, right, we're going to be gender neutral, which I think is what Philip Davis wants to achieve on the Women and Equalities Committee. If you go too far, then you tend to ignore the experiences, because gender is something that we live our lives through as a prism every day. Our experiences are affected by it. So if you ignore it, then you're actually doing a similar disservice than if you were gender biased in the first place. But what we need to do is, because we have this increasing dialogue about gender and how the construct of gender influences and interact with our lives, we have to be able to understand more about the stereotypes that are associated with domestic abuse, with things like harassment, with things like rape and serious sexual assault, in order to be able to provide victims with what they need. And the final thing I would say is that the ideas that I have talked about are the lived experience for male and female, homosexual and heterosexual men and women and victims daily. And it's our duty to challenge our perceptions of domestic abuse as they currently stand. Because if we fail to address gender and its influence adequately on how we perceive these crimes and on victims' experience, then we fail to give the victims the compassion, the support, and the recognition that they all fundamentally deserve. And I think that's what we as a society owe victims of domestic abuse. And one of the ways we can do that is by making those steps that don't fundamentally undermine the experience of some victims over others. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening. Does anybody, do we have brief time for?
Yeah, we definitely do. So Ben, fantastic. Thank you. And I think in a sense quite dangerous, because for a lot of people they will find it threatening to
yeah, well, there you go.
It challenges the narrative. So we do have time for questions. Would anybody like to ask a question?
It strikes me that one of the definitional failures of the Duluth model is that is how it deals with same-sex domestic violence.
Yeah.
And I would personally suggest putting the experience of gay men, gay women at the centre of things when constructing a sufficiently robust model to deal with same-sex, because if there isn't an obvious man to arrest, then police would have to actually, you can't throw them back on a situation where they don't have an obvious person to arrest unless you give them training of how do we interpret this. And whatever model of domestic violence you come up with has to be robust enough to work in the context of a same-sex domestic violence, and then hopefully you'd be able to reapply that back out into heterosexual relationships.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what the kind of increasing dialogue over maybe the past 5, 7 or 8 years, one of the main challenges that has been put forward to the Duluth model is, how does this explain homosexual relationships? And the reason that that's never been asked is because there's a lot of questions that we have never asked about homosexual relationships because of other issues within our society about homophobic beliefs, and the fact that the dialogue about homosexual relationships in general has only been really increasing and entering the public consciousness over the last 30, 40 years. So I totally agree, and that's one of the key kind of aims of the network that we put together, is to really kind of highlight those groups and do research on those groups and put those groups at the forefront in an area that they've hardly been considered at all, essentially, and even further undermines their experience than, say, male victims of female perpetrators.
It strikes me that that's probably the single fundamental definition of weakness of Duluth. That you know, obviously it's not enormous holding, but that's one of them.
Yeah, I agree.
Working with domestic abusers, both males and females, another thing which fits quite nicely within what you've described today is also what happens with female abusers that are now sent on the Freedom Programme, where they are cast as victims, obviously, and the content of the Freedom Programme then is a discourse about 6 or 8 male abusers, completely ignoring the fact that the woman herself might, as we had worked with a woman in Birmingham last month, recognised that she was the abusive person in the relationship, and is then afterwards being compelled by social services to attend the Freedom Programme just to make sure that she realises that she's really a victim under all of that. So.
And that's one of the additional problems with those stereotypes is that when and the social cognition is that when we have an experience or when we identify someone that is contrary to our expectations, we rationalise it in some way. And I think that is an example of rationalising in our minds how a woman could become a perpetrator or be a perpetrator, is thinking, well, the only way that could be a scenario is if she was also a victim. Whereas we would never have the same cognition with a man, because he fits already within our, it's like perpetrator, men, okay, it all fits. Whereas we have that challenge, and it's the same challenge that we have with male victims of sexual assault and rape. We have that same challenge within our minds of having to rationalise that heinous act and trying to make sense of it in what essentially is harm.
Another criticism of Duluth underneath all of that, of course, is that many of the abusers that we work with have also experienced had shocking experiences of children.
Yeah.
Of course, those are not permitted to be brought into Duluth's model, because that's just forming an excuse of blaming their parents for the way. Move on is the nonsense which they say. So.
I think what we've fallen into the trap of politically, policy-wise, trading-wise, and in academia, and I don't speak on behalf of academia, but one of the things that we've identified is oversimplifying what is an incredibly complicated issue and problem, and coming up with models that I just think fundamentally do a disservice to everybody they're trying to explain their experience of. And I think we need to have, one of the issues with that, unfortunately, is that not many people want to hear a debate that doesn't fall under, I'm going to be very careful with what I term here, what you might call a classic feminist narrative. So people aren't very willing to open up and talk in a way that addresses male issues, because it's not part of the broad narrative, and that's what Mark Brooks has talked about. It's not part of that broad narrative at the moment. And I think that's just terribly sad, because so much of what we do is pitting men against women, male issues against female issues. Well, I've always conceptualised it as that we're both fighting against the construct of gender and how it binds and restricts us all. That's the only way I've ever conceptualised it. So, and I just think, when do we get to a point where branding 500 or 600,000 victims of domestic abuse every year is acceptable, but just because they're male? That's never really sat well with me, which is why I'm here.
It could be seen as an example of what Martin Seeger has termed male gender blindness.
Yes,
which is a kind of cognitive bias which leads us just to somehow or other not see bad things happening when they're happening to men.
And that's only reinforced by policy and politics at the highest level, really. We're starting to see cracks emerge. We're chipping away slowly, and anybody who wants to learn more about the Men and Boys Coalition, which is the coalition that we've just set up, bringing together charities, academics, third sector parties to try and create a constructive space for male issues and to lobby government to kind of address it in a more gender inclusive way rather than this gender blind way.
This gentleman here.
Hi Ben, probably actually by the way, the official stats on domestic violence is already actually against dads who have to leave with their children. Where do they go? What do they do? How many refuges are available within the UK? Because when I set up Dad's house, there were 66 mother and baby hostels in London. Not one for dads.
No.
Not one for dads anywhere in the UK actually.
So,
so there's never been a point of contact
No.
where a man, whether it's gay, straight, dad, or
Yeah.
or anything that it can go to and pour his hat out, so it's an Andy Tell.
Yeah.
Where you've got all those charities, you know, they've got millions
Yeah.
and hundreds of thousands of pounds of funding
Millions.
collectively.
Yeah.
They've never helped another charity. And I've been doing this for 10 years.
Yeah.
And the Men's and Boys Coalition, how many people are here
Yeah.
from the Men's and Boys Coalition? I mean, this should be this night united, where people are actually coming to support you guys in this lecture.
Well, I mean, the thing is I'm happy there are so many people here. I wasn't expecting so many people, and that's part of an expectation that I think we've all built up about talking about male issues, and I'm sure you felt the same way. The increasing attendance at the male psychology conference. It's not popular. People don't want to hear it. People don't want to talk about it. And the thing is I come from a place where I think if there's even one victim from any type of background, then there should be support for them. But it amazes me on the other side of that thinking that 600,000 people can be ignored just because they have a penis.
But do you think men help men? They talk a good game, they won, but what do they do, and what actually do they do in the practical terms?
Well, there are a number of issues. I'm not. There are a number of issues with that because it's all marred in this gender politics. So gender politics has become quite a popular term recently. Everyone's having to define their gender politics. You know, I've already received a lot of flack for identifying as a feminist and all this kind of thing. So I think that to talk about male issues is a tricky one. To talk about it with other men, people are very quick to form their own opinions about what you're trying to do, who you're trying to do it for, where you belong on the gender politics spectrum, whether you're a men's rights activist or not. And combine that with a kind of socialised dislike for talking about issues between men and to other people, then you have a very hostile environment in order to address those issues, I think.
But do you think, I'll go back to saying what I said, it's because there's not an actual centre, a man's centre.
But that in itself...
There should be, no?
Well, not everybody understands the place that I'm coming from. So if I say I think that there should be a violence against women and boys, men and boys strategy, which I do think there should be one, people don't like that because it doesn't fit in with the grand narrative.
Yeah, but no one's going to agree with everybody anyway, so that doesn't make any difference. But someone has to make a difference and make a stand and say, listen, this is what should be done, actually.
Well, I think that's what we're trying to achieve with the Men and Boys Coalition, is finally trying to get people from all sides of the spectrum together and saying, regardless of your gender politics, regardless of your actual politics, and regardless of, whether you're feminist, anti-feminist or whatever, I mean, we don't accept any form of prejudice or anything like that, but regardless of where you come from, we're trying to get together, and I think that's what we're trying to do, is create and lobby for a space for a constructive conversation about male issues, and not one that is inherently pitched on the opposite side of female issues. We made it very clear, we want more funding for domestic abuse against men and centres and refuges, not at the detriment of women's centres and refuges. But in addition, I'm saying that's what we're trying to promote as a way of thinking, is it's not about pitching those two groups against each other, it's about acknowledging that the two groups exist and they have a gendered experience.
And if I can just kind of
Yeah.
jump in a bit. One of your questions was, I think, do men help each other as much as good? I think that male gender blindness affects everybody, men and women. I think we all don't really, it's a struggle to kind of to see when men are having problems. We all tend to think that they must be coping, they must be okay. For lots of reasons, we just don't seem to see it.
I'm talking about organisations, actually, not individuals. I'm talking about organisations who pretend to do things. They write policies, we can do this, but we can actually pick up that phone. No one's picking the phone up.
I would agree we need more of it, but I understand the hostile context in which it's occurring, and it is a challenge.
Okay, interesting stuff. Let's move on to this gentleman.
Men do help other men. We just don't help in the way that women help men. And we have a very gendered, it's very gendered because women have had the lead on this for several decades. Men don't necessarily want a centre We haven't
Yeah.
developed the language. We haven't developed the
Yeah.
mindset to actually look at what men's needs are. I mentor a lot of young men, and I tell them, take care of your needs: food, clothes, shelter. One person who loves you and accepts you as you are, and you doesn't want to change you, and one person who you love and accept as they are and don't want to change. They don't have to be the same person.
Yeah.
Those are your needs. Cover those, and you're fine. You're clear. You're home and dry for the rest of your life. And I think we're much more simple and less complex. This idea of the centre, yeah, we could have that, but would men turn up? I mean,
So whether,
Eric Pitts' experience
yeah.
running the shelter. Would
Yeah.
men work together, or would they compete against each other?
This is exactly what I'm saying about acknowledging that this is a crime affected by gender but isn't a gendered crime. Because I would love to live in a happy, clappy, lovely utopia where gender doesn't exist. And
No,
I'm not going to get into a debate about at what level those differences are innate or socialised. I think they're massively socialised, but whatever. The point is that gender is a lived experience for all of us every day. So the point is that we need to make whatever services that we come up with and whatever training we do appropriate to the gender that we're targeting it towards and acknowledging the lived experience that they have. So providing a female-based centre or female-based training, I mean, it's the same reverse model of why do we put all women in prison systems designed for men? It's the same kind of question. Why would we try and approach therapy the same way with men than we do for women? And I'm the last person who wants to reinforce gender stereotypes, believe me. I try and break them all the time. But it's not going to help anybody if we just pretend that they don't exist or we try to move too quickly to a position where they don't affect our thinking. The first step that we need to do at the moment is acknowledge that people of all different genders, all different sexualities are affected by domestic abuse and create services and needs that are adequate for those who suffer from such abuse.
One more thing.
So,
I mean, I agree with you about, we've launched housing, and it's the first in Europe for homeless single dads, where we've taken on 4 dads who were victims of domestic abuse, and to see the children food and housing, that's the chief basics for any man or woman actually, and we do that, you know. But so I disagree with you where when men access shelter, absolutely they would.
But that's for children. That's
Well, no, it's not.
Anyway,
parents.
Gents, this is one for the pub later on.
My experience
Okay, so
myself is very
let's have a
different.
question
Parent
from over here,
is a
please.
man.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised to see you have something up here about financial abuse. I just wondered if you could just give some information about that.
Yeah, so that's one of the areas of domestic abuse that's only recently kind of got any research attention, been recognised, because it's a very subtle form of, well, it can be subtle, it cannot be, but basically financial abuse is exerting that coercion or power through financial means. So that might be confiscating someone's credit card and saying they can only have it back when they behave. It might be insisting that all of their earnings or their money go through your account and you give them an allowance. It can range, but that's one of the areas that's not quite so frequently kind of acknowledged. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Question.
I worked with male perpetrators with the Duluth model for a short period of time. You're talking about domestic violence as perpetrator and victim. What I saw in the group of the men, because I just worked with the men, was that the women were violent as well. Their violence was often just dismissed. But what I saw from their stories is that they're in codependent violent relationships, and that's not what's been brought up here.
Yes, you're quite right.
Victim or perpetrator.
You're quite right, and often a lot of the studies do that because of the way that we have to design them. Because if you introduce too many factors, then they start to become meaningless, and the results won't make any sense. But I completely agree that part of the criticism that I made earlier of many models and of some of these researchers and the statistics themselves is that it's oversimplifying often a very complicated situation. And like you said, often couples are engaged in intimate partner terrorism, where they are both abusive. There's no clear perpetrator or victim defined. And that just adds another layer to the problem of the fact that so many people have to categorise the world in that way, and when they do so, they allocate gender in the way that would be expected. So you're 100% right, and I think that maybe that's something else we can address in the from the network is looking at how that plays in as a factor in people's judgments and how that affects, how they view these, and into future models as well, to look at cycles of violence rather than one-time perpetration.
Hi, I'm actually a graphic designer, so I only have so many limited knowledge. One question I had was like the social media things where you have your second life with your friends you don't actually see, you don't have any contact with. Obviously going into the basics, like cyberbullying and stuff.
Yeah.
But as support, especially for a man, myself, I tend to go on there a lot, and there's a lot of, like with the video you showed about the experiment industry, and there's a lot of those going on, especially with the younger generation as well, and how they perceive it. And I'm just wondering, is that kind of where some people have their own, where everything's so complex, everyone has their own branch off for support, and I think some people now, especially the new generation, tend to talk to their digital crowd, their second life, and they share their experiences through there, but also gets branched off from the media, the way things, like you can't really control something once it's online because it's all these complex roots shared domestic.
That's really interesting, and I think, that could, it's not something I've kind of identified as a way things are going, but it's definitely a way things could go, and particularly if that interacted with gender. So it might be that men prefer that avenue of support because it's much more anonymous.
Yeah.
And doesn't involve you getting in a room and pouring out your feelings in front of a fellow person, which many men feel uncomfortable doing. So it's about, it ties into that other, the point I made earlier. It's about designing and administrating and funding appropriate services that will take into account the lived experience of victims. So if that's part, if that could be part of that, then I see no reason why it couldn't be. That's a really interesting point. Thank you.
One of the things I found slightly incongruent when you said these are the things that we associate with masculinity, these are the things we associate with femininity. So it makes sense that masculine is going to be the perpetrator and makes sense that feminine is going to be the victim. One I found incongruent, and I think is interesting, is emotion. You'd think that being violent was an emotional thing to do. And it seems that that's been one of the things we've done in the way we look at violence, or certainly look at abuse, where abuse is talked about, is we've taken emotion away from it and go, somebody who's been abusive, losing their temper, losing control, is not being emotional, and therefore they're being calculating and like Moriarty. And therefore emotion's good, because emotion's on the feminine side, emotion's good, and violence is bad. Well, we would agree that violence is bad, but you'd also agree that violence was something emotional, ordinarily, you think it was something.
Well, for me, it could be less tied into whether it's involving emotion or not, and more tied into how that emotion is expressed, managed, outletted. So it could be that, there's the same, many studies show that self-reported emotion is very different to felt emotion. So men and women have very similar physiological reactions in terms of empathy, but they express it very differently. So it could be that men express their emotion, do that aggression in that way, and women do in a different way. So it's not so much that men are emotionless, and maybe that was slightly misconstrued on there. It's not so much that men don't have emotion and women do have it. It's that the way that we channel that emotion, the way that we express that emotion, our willingness to talk about things about emotion, and the way emotion might manifest within those acts might be very different.
Yeah. Another thing I was going to pick up in Friends, even though the Friends was dealing with that. One of the interesting things is she didn't realise, she didn't know that she was hurting him, and that was one of the things. She had no agency in that story because she still didn't know. So she's
you're totally right.
So that was the way that character was portrayed. Obviously as a comedy, it would probably been less funny if she'd actually been seriously violent in a way.
Because it's Friends, obviously it's meant to be gentle. But you're completely right. So we focused on the fact that men often don't realise they're victims. But that's very much the case, and the other example I would use is things like harassment. So it's very hard to figure out whether men are harassed or not, because often they don't realise that what they are receiving constitutes harassment, because it just hasn't been told to them in that way. The story hasn't been created, and it's the same for female perpetrators in a way, where they're kind of thinking and not even realising what they're doing is perpetration because they haven't had that dialogue, or there's been no representation of that in any model or anything like that. I completely agree, because I think now that I've thought about it more, I've been harassed when I've been out, but I've never viewed it as harassment. And I think many men would feel like that. They have might have our bums pinched on the dance floor or something like that. And if you think about it, a good thing to do for everybody is to just think what would happen if the genders were switched here, and you'd be like, oh, if I was a woman, I'd be really annoyed because my bum's just been pinched. Whereas with a man, we're like, oh, we just have to get on with it because because it's not even harassment, or even if it is harassment, then we should just get on with it. So yeah, you're very right.
Okay, I think time for just maybe another 1 or 2 questions.
Just an observation again, we're using the word perpetrator. Perpetrator means guilty of a crime. That word has been chosen very carefully. So we work with abusers who have not been convicted and perpetrators that have been convicted. Okay? And another interesting little facet is that in the last two weeks we've come across 2 cases where the individual was found not guilty in a court of law on the beyond reasonable doubt, but was found guilty of the same things in the family court where on the balance of probability was the rule. And of course the person holds the not guilty concept of the court against the guilty version of the family court. But we do need to separate out abusers and perpetrators because everybody's being cast as a perpetrator, guilty until they can establish their innocence, whereas fundamentally, of course, they're all innocent until.
And that's a symptom of the language in academia. So that's just my manifestation of the language, and maybe that is also something we should look at, because it does help to reinforce our ideas about domestic abuse and domestic violence. Like, language is so important in how we perceive all of these things, and that could also contribute, especially to making it seem like a clear-cut thing, which is exactly what you said before. It could be much more intimate part of terrorism. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think a final question.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I made this point clear earlier, that men do support each other, but they don't support each other when they're in crisis.
Yeah.
That's been my experience, that's what I found. It's like, and it may be because there's gendered stereotypes of unpredictable, possible violence, or just how men deal with emotion.
Yeah, and because also the way that, because I've done a lot of research on pro-social behaviour, so being good and being nice, and the way men are nice is very, very different to the way women are nice. It's not that either does any of it more, which has been a common misconception. And I did a focus group with 12-year-olds, which was very challenging, and they said that I did one with boys, one with girls, and one mixed. And we talked about how boys would emotionally support each other. And the boys were like, well, if it was like your best friend and they just came to you and they're like, Nan died, I'd like talk to them and maybe like pat them on the back. And if it was in a group, I'd maybe like make a joke about their Nan being dead. So boys use humour as pro-sociality and to try and lighten the mood and to try and be helpful, whether that is actually helpful or not. And in those periods of crisis, I think we need to do more to kind of instill it in boys not to panic with emotional expression, or to channel their emotions in different ways, or to deal with those emotions. But the point I made before, and I've just taught a whole module on it, is about all the systematic barriers that we put in front of boys in terms of expressing their emotion and in terms of expressing things that are traditionally feminine. You know, parents actively lead their boys away from emotional expression during things like story time and reading books. They're much more focused with boys on the outcome. You know, what did this do? Well, how has it ended? Whereas with girls, like, how do you think that the characters feel? So we do socialise and we do teach our boys and girls to think about emotion differently and to use it in different ways. So yeah.